Thanks everyone for joining today. Welcome to this PRCA event. I'm your host for the day. My name's Beth. I'm part of the PRCA charity and not-for-profit group. I also work in the charity sector across communications and brand. We've got a lovely panel here today to talk to you. We are recording the session, so it will be sent out to everyone who signed up to it after this session, and it will also be shared on the PRCA channels, social media channels. As I said, there will be an opportunity to ask questions, so please do pop them either in the Q&A or in the chat, whatever's easiest for you, and I'll make sure I circle back to them at the end. We're going to have a panel discussion, so we've got a few topics that we're going to run through and hear from everyone who's here today, and then we'll do Q&A at the end, so we'll come back down to that. We're here to talk about all things flexible working, so that's including 4-day weeks and job sharing, and looking at the kind of environment, I guess, of flexible working today. We've seen so many changes across the sector, so both within communications or brand or PR or fundraising, but especially across the charity sector, and we're just really here to get an idea of how different people are doing it now and what some of the challenges and benefits are of flexible working within the workplace. So we're joined today by Lizzie and Anna, who job share at Leukaemia UK as Director of Communications. So hi Lizzie and Anna, thanks for joining us.
Hello, thanks for having us.
Hi. We're also joined by Jade, who's the Associate Director of People at London's Air Ambulance charity. Hi Jade.
Hi, nice to be here.
And last but not least, we're joined by Adrian, who's Head of People at Friends of the Earth. So hi Adrian, thanks for joining. So I'm going to ask a few general questions and just jump in, I think, if you guys have got anything burning that you'd like to say on the topics. So as I mentioned in the intro, especially since COVID, there's been quite a few changes in terms of how we go to work and flexible working. What do you guys think have been the most significant changes that you've seen, either within your own workplace or generally within the sector? What do you think sort of stands out to you the most?
I can start with the obvious one, which is that the law's now changed around flexible working. So not necessarily the hybrid bit, but the flexible working. So the new flexible working rules were introduced in 2023.
I actually didn't know that, Jade.
Well, there you go. So basically, employers can't outright reject any flexible working requests. Then they must consult with employees to discuss alternative arrangements. And it's also available from day one of employment. So yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, so you don't have to go through a probation or anything like that before you're allowed to ask for flexible working.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's focused the attention of organisations definitely on what their parameters would be and what their criteria would be and what they'll allow.
And maybe forced organisations to think about it a bit more in advance of recruitment. Yeah, interesting. Adrian, have you seen any of that in your role at Friends of the Earth?
Yeah, I mean we have moved to formal hybrid working and we have a very flexible approach. So the minimum that you have to do is attend an in-person event at least once a fortnight on average.
Yeah.
In practice, a lot of people spend quite a bit more time than that in the actual physical workplace, but most people are at home most of the time. And I guess, I mean, a very visible example of what's changed is actually this, that, you know, this is how I interact with most of my colleagues a lot of the time, and obviously with yourselves. And that's a great benefit in terms of saving time and costs in terms of traveling. Environmentally, it's good as well, we would certainly say. But it does have its challenges and its downsides, because I mean, I joined Friends of the Earth just under 2 years ago, when there were still restrictions on travel and meeting in person and so on. So it was quite strange coming into an organisation which was entirely virtual at that point. So we do make a point that people do need to meet, and we have collaboration days and collaboration events where the key focus is actually being with somebody in the room at the same time. So I think one of the things for me, which is important, is absolutely brilliant to be able to embrace more flexible ways of working. That's a lot more inclusive in a lot of ways, but we do need to keep the human touch.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think it's really great for expanding your networks as well. You know, for example, all of us sort of meeting and speaking here today, and everyone who's joined, you know, you wouldn't ordinarily get to spend that much time with people if you know, this sort of virtual world wasn't an option. But yeah, really, really important to make sure you keep that human connection as well. And Anna, what are the most significant changes that you think you've seen since COVID, really, since this all began?
I mean, again, I think probably just the most obvious one is the hybrid working, and I guess expectations around that now since COVID, and probably particularly in the charity sector, I would imagine it's probably quite unusual for people, unless they really want to be going into the office 5 days a week, or for the expectation to have people in the office 5 days a week. And it's just, feels like that's completely shifted post COVID in terms of what organisations want and are kind of happy to offer, and what people's expectations are as well. So as Adrian was saying, we've just been through the process of kind of reviewing and firming up a new hybrid working policy for all of our staff, which again sounds quite similar. So everyone having to come into the office a couple of days a month as a minimum, but the opportunity for people to come in as much as they want to and suits them and their working style. And their kind of, you know, arrangements with inside and outside of work, I guess. So that certainly seems like that's been the most obvious and kind of quite dramatic shift, I guess, over the past couple of weeks, past couple of years, in terms of how people are working.
Yeah, and I think I felt it even more dramatically, I guess, because I actually came back from maternity leave in 2021. So kind of there'd already been it must have been 2020, I lose track, but at least 6 months or so of kind of everyone working from home. And obviously that was just a completely different world than the one I'd left. And I think I was already working flexibly before. Anna and I were already doing our job share. I was already working 3 days a week, and I did tend to do 1 day at home. But I think often you felt like a bit of an outlier when you were at home, and you didn't necessarily feel integrated into the meetings and the conversations that were happening in the office. And I think the marked difference for me was kind of the amount of interactions I had coming into it when everyone was at home, and, you know, everyone was in the same position, and it kind of, no one felt cut out. And I probably had more conversations with people in offices, this was when we were at shelter, offices elsewhere in the country, than I'd ever had before. So I think that was a really kind of big plus of it, really, that you could just have easier kind of conversations with a lot more people in your organizations. And I think now it's almost getting the balance right, isn't it? So that sort of having the FaceTime, as Adrian said, is still really, really important, but recognizing kind of when those important moments are, and, you know, not, I think I used to find I'd travel into the office, do a nursery run, be kind of out of breath getting in, to then not really need to be there, whereas now you feel like you go in because you need to kind of catch up with people, and it's an advantage to you rather than just for the sake of it. So I think we're all sort of trying to get that balance right now, aren't we, where we've got the opportunity to do both and see what works for everyone, which is ultimately very flexible, because you can choose kind of in some ways how often you need
absolutely. And it's really interesting, that point around your network, and sort of I remember that sort of coming back in from COVID as well, and realizing that there's loads more people in the organisation that I never would have had any interaction with, really. But somehow, by putting everyone online, it gave you that opportunity to speak to more of your colleagues across the country than you ever would have had the opportunity to before. And I think that leads us into, you know, looking at I guess the main benefits and challenges that you guys within your organisations have found with more flexible hybrid working. If you had to sort of, you know, pin down like one really key challenge that you're facing at the moment versus one really key benefit, what do you think that would be? Jade, I might circle back to you.
Sure. So I think the thing that we're grappling with at the moment is a lack of cultural cohesion. So you've got lots of people distributed all over the place who are all having a really different experience of what working life is in our organisation. We've got the additional challenge of having a 24/7 service alongside a charity team, you know, frontline delivery service alongside a charity team, which I think we can touch on later. But you know, for the people who are in different generations, we've got 4 different generations at work. Each of them have a slightly different expectation of what working life should be and what they want it to be. And I think you add on top of that the fact that we have it, like all charities, there's a shared sense of purpose, and we all work together to deliver our amazing service. What does that look like when you're not all in the office at the same time in the same space, and you all have a slightly different understanding of what the organization's culture is? So bringing that all back together again is one of our biggest challenges, whilst maintaining the flexibility.
Yeah. And is that something that within your organisation the people team are working on, or is it sort of driven from trustees or the board, or is it collaboration? Like, who's doing that piece, I guess?
Yeah, I think it's on the minds of our directors and our trustees. I think they understand the importance of the culture in driving performance and unity, so it's definitely on their minds. But I think just for everybody, it's about feeling like you belong to the organization and feeling like you've got the access to the people that you need, that the two parts of our organization are actually working towards the same thing. I think that's actually a shared experience, so everybody sees a responsibility in that, and certainly the people team are looking at how we bring it all together.
Yeah. And what do you think is the key benefit of the more sort of flexible hybrid ways of working we're experiencing now?
I think from speaking to people, they value that flexibility. It's what you were talking about earlier, Lizzie, that you can organise your life and your work to get a better balance. So you are where you need to be when that's your priority, and then you deal with your life stuff, and you can fully focus on your work stuff when you're working. I think that it's having that balance and that flexibility that people really value. And actually it makes you more productive because you make the most of the time that you have while you're working, because everything else you can sort out.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that I value that. There's a lot to do in life. Adrian, how about yourself? Is there a key challenge and benefit that you would highlight?
I think the challenge is maybe similar to what Jade's just been saying. It is that whole issue about cohesion and the risk of things like isolation. We've still got probably the majority of our staff are London-based, so have a focus around our office in Stockwell. But around 40% of the staff are distributed around the country, and that we've always had people around the country to some degree, but it's becoming more so. So I think obviously there's a challenge if somebody is working by themselves, and I know we can, as we've just been talking about, we can communicate by Teams or Zoom or whatever, but there is that issue for somebody about, because we have a lot of flexibility. We've abolished core hours, so as long as people do a 7.5-hour day between 8 in the morning and 9 at night, it's very much up to them. As long, that we do have, sometimes they have to be at meetings and so on, but there is always that challenge that alongside the flexibility, there's the whole issue about when does my work stop and when does it begin and when does my outside life begin. So I do think that's something we need to be mindful of, that in terms of expectations on people, as well as the fact that at the very end of the day, not everybody can work at home. Not everybody's got the space or the environment where they can focus on their work and so on. A vast majority of my colleagues work at home, but we do have some people who prefer to come into an office and so on. So I think there's that challenge of making sure there is some level of choice, and that people, we focus on people's well-being, that it's not just well, off you go and work at home. But the other side of that is, it's the flexibility allows for greater inclusion. I think it helps a great deal. We don't have the same issues that we used to have about people needing to go off and do other things through the day. We do have the benefit as well that we've moved to a 4-day working week, so everybody's got one sort of weekday where they can entirely focus on their lives. I think that's helped as well. But I think it's, as with everything, there's a lot of adjusting to do. So I think it's always being mindful of that, and not everybody can adjust in the same way at the same time, and we just need to be open and empathetic to that fact.
Yeah, that's interesting. One of your points made me think of, when we were all going into the office 9 to 5, there was often quite a lot of pressure on presenteeism, making sure that you had to be there and you had to be seen to be working 9 till 5, if not till 6 or 7. In some environments, the later you worked, the more committed you were, and all of that. And actually, that's, to me, that feels like that's gone now, but you've almost kind of slipped over into then having an issue with boundaries instead.
Yeah.
And people will WhatsApp you a question at 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night, because it's just so normal to have all these channels to people, and you wouldn't normally be thinking about asking someone a question at 8 o'clock at night, because you'd see them at 8 o'clock in the morning, but that isn't necessarily the case anymore. So yeah, you need to sort of focus on your boundaries rather than focusing on how much you're being seen in the office. So it's just a different challenge, I guess, that's come across.
Yeah, I think the blurring of work and life has been both an advantage and a disadvantage. I think there was some view before you sort of came to work and you had to almost pretend that you didn't have kids and you hadn't just done a nursery run, and that you're present at work. And I think during COVID, often there were kids in the background, there was loads going on, and you weren't necessarily doing that 9 to 5 because you had to fit around kind of family life more so than ever because of the lack of childcare. But I think that did at least give a glimpse into everyone's kind of life. If you're working from home, people are seeing in the background kind of where you are, which I think is kind of a nice thing, to give you that sort of insight. But at the same time, you do need to draw the line of where kind of your work life and your home life start and end. And I think, again, it's as ever about balance, but I think it's trying to get the balance that's right for you, I suppose. And as Adrian said, some people crave that being in the office Monday to Friday, and really want that, and would feel very isolated at home, whereas others prefer it at home. And I think almost for organizations, it's hard to then make sure that you're setting up a policy that allows kind of for that flexibility and kind of for people to work in the way they want to work, while still kind of being productive and delivering what they need to do, and not creating rules for the sake of rules. But at the same time, you do need some kind of boundary that, we do need some face time every month, so 2 days a week. You might land on that. Other organizations might feel like it's more, others might feel like it's none, and it's all the way up to, the individual. So it's kind of working out where your boundaries should lie as an organization. I think is quite important.
And how have you guys managed that as director in your role? You're director of a team, so it's up to you, I guess, to say, these are the days we should come in, these are the things we should come in for. Have you kind of laid that down to your team, judging by getting to know everyone and seeing what's best for each individual and trying to mash all of that or bring all of that together somehow? How did you manage that within your team?
Yeah, I mean, I think having like a framework across the whole organisation has been really helpful, because there's a particular kind of system that we're working within. So that's been great in terms of giving the opportunity for everyone to have quite a lot of flexibility, I would say, but also for there to be some consistency in terms of what's expected of people in terms of coming into the office. And then within the team, I mean, the organisation as a whole, again, kind of very much values flexibility and sort of promoting flexibility as something that is prioritised for everyone who works there. So I think we very much take that into account in terms of team planning and trying to manage meetings as hybrid as much as possible. And we do have quite a few people who are based outside of London. So just thinking about the benefits of kind of new ways of working, one of those definitely that we've found both at Shelter and Leukaemia UK has been, in terms of recruitment, you have a much broader pool of people open to you, because people aren't having to be in London every day, which is great, and definitely something that we have found has been a real benefit. But then obviously that does mean that it's not necessarily easy to get people in at short notice or frequently. So we try to have quite a flexible approach within the team, and just make sure that things are run where possible as hybrid meetings, so that there's a chance for people to join as suits them. And then across the organisation, we're aiming to have 1 day a month where everybody is in, so that there's more of a chance for everyone to connect across the organisation, which hopefully should be a really positive thing for people. Within the team, it's fairly flexible, and definitely a kind of hybrid hybrid approach.
Yeah. And you guys were mentioning just before our call that you've actually moved offices yesterday, did you say?
Yes, well, we had our first all staff event in our
Oh,
new
I
office
see.
yesterday. Yeah, we've been in about 2 weeks now.
Yeah, and I'm interested in that actually is kind of one of our discussion topics, because obviously a lot of people had, you know, big office buildings and everyone was in every day. And as time's gone on, it maybe has become more obvious that you don't need all of those spaces all the time. Yet sometimes there's, you know, there's days where you need more room than you seem to have capacity for. What are your views on that? I guess kind of a, you know, remote office space versus actually physically going in, and what should charities do, or what should they be considering? You know, if they're sat there thinking, I just don't think we need all this room now, are there any considerations that you guys would highlight?
Yeah, I mean, I would say our previous premises was gifted to us, and to actually an organisation pre-merger who I think had about 5 people, and it was a little basement that was gifted to us in Portland Place. And I think we're now sort of 25 people, so clearly had very much outgrown the office. And I think our chief executive also, for cultural reasons, really wanted us to really have a sort of a home and a space that felt like, you know, this is Leukaemia UK's like hub, as it were. So I think it was quite important for that as to kind of why we wanted to move. And you know, it's not a big space, but it does have the capacity that if everyone was in, probably not everyone would have a desk, but everyone could, you know, at least sit. So, you know, we can do like big group meetings and things like that, which I think is really important culturally. I think especially when it's an organization that is quite small, the opportunity for us all to get together in a place that feels a nice place to be, where people want to be, I think is really important. And there are, you know, quite a few people that are in the office multiple times a week, so for them to have a really nice space where they can work and they can do meetings and the tech's all there and things like that, I think again is really important. But certainly Anna and I sort of felt it from the other side as well, where the shelter offices underwent quite a big kind of refurb during COVID. So we went from having very clear, like, this is the comms and policy floor and this is the fundraising floor, to the whole kind of quite large building being hot desking. And you definitely felt that more disconnect, I think, with the sort of team spirit cultural element, when you kind of don't quite know who you're going to be sitting next to. Your team might be on different floors. So I think, again, that's where organizations just have to work harder, I think, to make sure that you've got those touch points where everyone can get together in a positive way, and it never feel for the sake of it. Sort of, it's, you know, when you're getting together, it's you're doing really good work and you're doing those sort of more creative meetings often that are really hard to do virtually, and making it kind of a real point to keep that culture and that kind of working together face-to-face thing alive, because it can easily, when you're not, you know, hot desking and moving around, you can lose that quite quickly, I think.
Yeah, I find that people are really creatures of habit as well, and even though you're hot desking, you go in and go to the same desk every day. If you walk in and someone's sat at that desk, you're a bit like, oh god, where do I sit? Oh well, congrats on the new office, sounds exciting. Adrian, do you have any views on a kind of a remote space versus physical office space?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we are doing is maybe echoes to some extent what Lizzie's been saying. We have a fairly large office in Stockwell, which is divided into 2 wings, and we're actually relinquishing one of the wings and so on. So we're reducing by 50% in effect.
Right.
And I think that, you know, that is almost inevitable, that employers need to look at what is sensible. If you have an organization which is predominantly hybrid and people are spending most of the time at home, we obviously can't guarantee that everybody's got a desk all the time and you can just pop in when you feel like and there's a desk. So so we reckon we can do with 50% less capacity. That will obviously save us a significant amount of money, of which we can obviously use for other purposes. And I think, you know, that there is that inevitability that, you know, for the rest of the country, we do have offices in managed offices that we rent around the place. And these are getting smaller as well, because again, I mean, I live in Huddersfield, I work at home. We have an office in Leeds I go up to, and the space for 7 or 8 people there, and I think I've probably seen 1 or 2 colleagues there most of the time, and so on have been out there. So I do suspect that and I'm not talking about us in particular, but more generally, the next few years, there will be fewer and fewer physical locations, because it's not just where we're at the moment. I think as artificial intelligence and people's expectations move on, there will be a continuing change about how we work and where we work and so on. And I think we need to be geared up to that. And that's where I think it's important not to get too anchored in being in a particular place for the types of jobs we're in. Obviously, I think do need to be mindful that a lot of other people and a lot of other work is still having to be done physically through the pandemic. I mean, we talk about virtual work, but both in the voluntary sector and more widely, 65% of people continued to go to physical workspaces during the pandemic. So, you know, for a lot of people, the reality hasn't changed that much, but there will be a growing expectation that a lot of that work should be done differently too. So I think it's just about being open to change and being mindful that how we are maybe planning to do things right now will pretty much be overtaken by events in the next 2, 3, 4 or 5 years.
Scary to think of how AI can impact us in day to day, isn't it? And sort of how you can, I don't know, keep involved, and you'll never be ahead of it, but keep up to date with it.
We won't be ahead necessarily, but I think there's a lot of ways we can embrace it. I mean, it can be seen as a threat, and I think if we just let it happen, then it could be. And if it's all about commercial use of it, then yeah. But I think this is where the voluntary sector has a big part to play in seeing how you can harness it for good ends, and that, you know, it can help enhance work. And it can help give human beings space to do other types of work, because I mean, there's some aspects of AI in terms of what I've seen can be quite creative, but you can still feel that lack of human empathy, which at the end of the day, the tools that we use, and AI is ultimately a tool, should be geared to the ends of what the humans need, as opposed to what do the tools tell us to do.
You
So
need
I
a
think
human filter at the end of it, don't you?
we do, and I think it's important that we gear up to take advantage of it, but also shape it to our purposes.
Are there any specific developments that you'd relate to flexible working or remote working that you think AI is particularly interesting for?
I think communications is a big part and so on in term, and I think also, and it's probably not necessarily about remote working, but I think inclusion. I think one thing I was talking to a colleague about a couple of days ago, because we were starting to look at AI, is how AI can help gear your communications internally to be more inclusive. And actually, if we look at maybe the whole issue of how we support and embrace working with neurodiversity, AI can potentially be a really tremendous aid to that and to everybody in an organization. Because personally, I think if you look at adjustments for, say, ADHD inclusion, it's actually just about having a sensible approach to communications and how we work. It makes sense for everybody. It doesn't need to be something you bolt on for people with neurodiversity. It actually should just be a standard way of working, from what I can see. Yeah, and I think AI can help that. So that's it.
Jade, what do you think? You're nodding in agreement.
Yeah, it's interesting because we've just been exploring that as an organisation ourselves. And actually, a lot of the tools are available. You can get closed captioning on Zoom and on Teams, and I wasn't aware of that until we started looking into it. And I think, you know, there's a lot to explore there that we've got already without even looking at what AI can add to that.
Yeah, really interesting. And it all feeds into the picture of kind of future workforce and what direction we're all going in, for sure. On that note, do we think everyone's up to speed? Do we think everyone's kind of, you know, speaking to you guys, there's a lot going on in terms of, you know, changing ways of working and keeping up to speed with what's going on and new developments and, you know, new tech and different things that we can use. But do you get the sense that that's the same across the sector, or do you feel that there's probably a few organizations doing it really well and lots of other places sort of, you know, still needing to develop on that front?
I think it's taken a long time to settle coming out of the pandemic, I think, and just, you know, looking at office spaces. I know that where we didn't want to have a huge outlay in terms of our office space until we knew what our working pattern was going to look like, and I'm not even sure we know that yet. because it's still all adjusting. But we know that in the office, we need more shared working spaces. We're always running out of meeting room. The things that people do when they come into the office are different. You know, Lizzie, you were talking about the work that you do that is better face to face, like the creative work. We don't necessarily have the spaces in our office that really facilitate that. If bringing people together is one of the reasons we want them to be in the office, then that should be reflected in the kind of space that we're working in, and we're not there yet. So I think with some things like the tech platforms that we're using, we had to pivot to use them quite quickly at the beginning of the pandemic. So that feels like in our organization, at least, that's quite stable, well, as stable as the platforms allow. And then there's some bits that we're still catching up with.
I guess I get the sense that organizations are sort of learning and evolving as they go, because I think, you know, as the pandemic showed, we do live in an unpredictable world, and if you can take any positives from the pandemic, it is that it proved that, you know, if push comes to shove, everyone can work from home and still be productive, which is a really positive thing that we should kind of cling on to. As you know, you're being told from external sources that, you know, everyone should be in the office more, and, you know, it's all about FaceTime, and for the economy we should, you know, get back to London. So I think it's where, yeah, organizations, I think, are all different and are all having to find their feet and work out what works for them and for their workforce. And I think, as we've already talked about, just being very attuned to cultural kind of elements, because I think, as we all know, when you've got a happy, fulfilled workforce, they are going to deliver more for that organization.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important to always be mindful of kind of what your employees are looking for, and what works for them, that will also then hopefully work for kind of delivering the, you know, the strategic aims of the organization. But it very much seems like it's a kind of learn as you go sort of thing at the moment, because it is a bit of a new world that we're all navigating, and new technology coming all the time as well.
Yeah, constantly changing.
Just to add on job sharing specifically, I guess, just because Lizzie and I have job shared for a number of years now, and we have moved role as a job share. One of the things that we were quite surprised by when we were kind of thinking about moving as a job share was just kind of having initial conversations with people about, you know, the idea of doing that, was how unfamiliar people were with the idea of job sharing, and that it seemed something a bit strange and new, and that people didn't quite know how to sort of respond to, or what it would involve. So I think that was quite interesting for us, who, having job shared for quite a long time, saw it as a very normal thing, and probably assumed it was something that was taken up quite widely across the sector, but that kind of didn't seem to be the case, in terms of like some of the conversations we had about sort of how that was operating more widely. So yeah, that was on that kind of specific area, so that was quite interesting.
Yeah, I mean, let's delve into the job share, because, as you said, so you guys actually started off the job share at one organisation and then moved as a pair somewhere else. I personally find I'm seeing more and more about job shares now. I'm seeing more ads for people who are job sharing, and, you know, just generally talking to different colleagues and clients within the third sector. There's lots of people who now job share. How did you guys, I guess, because you've job shared for so long, how did that start? How did that come about?
Well, it came about initially when we worked at Shelter, and we'd both been on maternity leave.
Right.
And when we came back, we were both quite keen to work part-time if we could. And there was actually a new role that had been developed within the comms team, and it was a suggestion from our director at the time that maybe we could do that as a job share. So it was actually his idea, and a very, very good one. So we both came back and took up that role, doing 3 days a week each. So that was, I actually don't know how many years ago, probably 6 years ago, something like that. So yeah, we started doing that at Shelter. We moved within Shelter into quite a few different roles internally within communications. And then last year we moved to Leukaemia UK as a job share. So it wasn't a role advertised as a job share role, but it was kind of, you know, suggested that they were open to sort of more flexible working arrangements. Yeah, so we applied as a pair and then moved there at the end of last year.
Do you literally, excuse my ignorance here, will you literally go in an interview as a pair? Yeah. So interesting. Love it.
Yeah, we're trying to follow the pattern today where it's like one answers first and the other chips in, because we found that was
it's very impressive.
But I think we both have found, I don't know, when you go off and have children and decide that actually, you know, working 5 days a week is no longer practical, I think we were just very grateful that we kind of found each other and then have been able to kind of continue in our career trajectory as a pair, and I guess apply for a, you know, what was it, a director level role, which I don't think either of us were prepared to do as a full-time job. So it sort of just opened up doors for us that, you know, might have felt closed a few years ago to someone who wanted to work 3 days a week. And that's where I'm sort of very, very much for championing the job share, because as we talked about, you know, work and life have different demands and priorities. And I think just because you decide that, you know, you want to work less than 5 days a week, that doesn't mean that you should then have kind of all your career prospects kind of end at that point. And I think if we want to encourage you know, diversity in the workplace, and then I think we have to do that and give people those opportunities. So yeah, I think I'm very, very grateful for that, and you know, pleased that I think Anna and I have found a partnership that works as well, which is of course part of it. And you know, we say two brains can be better than one. So actually, you know, we feel like for employers we're offering more in a way, because you know, we often bounce off ideas, and you know, we've kind of had a discussion about something before we even reach the point of pitching it, whereas or normally if it's just you, then it's, you know, you don't necessarily have that. And I think if we disagree on something, it's normally, doesn't happen that often actually, but it's normally a good thing, because we can again kind of get to hopefully a better end product as a result. So I think there's so many pros to it. So I just really encourage like employers to embrace it as a concept, because I do think that it will really help get some really strong candidates kind of in the workplace and in roles that maybe that weren't open to them before.
Yeah, and what, obviously you guys kind of applied for this latest role as a pair. What would you recommend if someone, you know, was wanting to apply for a role, needed it to be part-time, but didn't necessarily have their counterpart? Is there a way of applying for that and sort of suggesting that it could be a job share, or what would the best way be of going about it?
Yeah, I mean, we approached recruiters sort of before. If we found a job we quite like the look of, we approached before and said, you know, we'd be thinking of applying as a pair. I guess for them, it's almost an easier decision because we were already like the equivalent of a full-time person. But I think, again, you would hope if you're an open-minded, either a recruiter or, you know, an in-house HR person, that, you know, if you saw someone that had the skills, then there are certainly some specialist, I think, recruitment companies that can then match you up with a pair to make it up to a full-time person. I think the more we talk about that, and again, the more of those kind of specialist recruitment services there are, the better, really. Because I think they do exist, but they probably just need to be talked about a bit more and normalized, I suppose. So it doesn't, because we did find with some recruiters, it was, as Anna said, a bit of a, oh, I'm not sure, I've not really thought about that. And it was almost seen as a barrier, whereas we want to break down the barrier and it be seen as a positive and something that should just be, you know, an option for all roles, really, if you can find the right pairing.
Yeah, I'm definitely seeing more of it, so it's working.
I was just going to say, in terms of like potential employers, I think the other area is just around cost as well, and like potentially some people seeing that as a barrier. So kind of having a conversation about hours for the role. So the job share that we do at the moment, we do 2.5 days each. So our cost is no more than one person, whereas we have also done 3 days a week where it felt like actually there was enough work and enough of a role for, you know, to justify that extra spend for it. So I guess kind of understanding from an employer's perspective what their sort of parameters are, and then how you can you know, adapt accordingly, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, interesting to have those discussions from the outset as well. Adrian, we're interested in hearing from you particularly, and we've had a flurry of questions as well, looking at the Friends of the Earth 4-day week policy. Interested to know, I guess, how that came about. What have there been any sort of lessons learned? Are you able to measure its impact, or just anything you'd want to share with the group?
Sure. Well, our purpose as an organisation is about obviously change and changing the way that the world works and so on, including obviously looking at how we organise our lives and our work. I think there's been a lot of pilots and experiments around the world, and the 4-day week was first trialled, particularly in Iceland and Denmark. It's now the standard working week in Iceland and for much of the Danish public sector. And there's also recently been a number of pilots in the UK, which were run by the 4-day working week campaign. And they were very, very successful. About 92% of organizations have retained the 4-day week. So we were looking at what made that sort of thing possible, and whether or not it could apply to our organization. The thinking actually came by, I don't know, osmosis or whatever, that at the same time as management were thinking about it, the union, we have a recognised union, proposed it as well as, so we had a JNC, a negotiating meeting where both sides by chance put the same proposals forward. So that was a nice sort of outcome. We have a very sort of progressive approach to work, and just to echo what Lizzie and Dana were saying, our chief executives are job shares and have been for some time. And we find, that works really well. So we spent much of last year looking at how we could apply a 4-day working week without loss of pay. And we implemented that start of December last year. I think the thinking behind it is very much, as we are finding, although it's not always just quite as smooth as it might sound, is that if you have more free time, you are better refreshed, and so you can focus more at work. And the big driver behind a lot of that is technology. So particularly in what might have in the past been termed white collar type roles, office work and so on, you can see that, for example, by one measure, what took a whole day to do in 1974, thanks to sort of computerization, by 2014, that reduced to 90 minutes, and there's been more productivity gains since then. Now, in a world where, certainly our argument be that you can't just focus on continually producing more and more and more, then at some point these productivity gains, both ethically and we think sort of responsibly, should be shared, not just in forms of more productivity, but actually in giving people more time. And if you look at the history of work, 200 years ago, the standard working week was 90 hours plus. By the mid-1950s, it was down to 45 hours. It's really slowed since then, in spite of the fact that productivity has shot up far more than any time previously. So we sort of think this is the way forward in terms of having a happier work-life balance. We had very good feedback from people about having the extra time. We haven't changed any of our work plans on the basis of a 4-day week. We anticipate ourselves being as productive as before. If you look at it, certainly from our perspective of wanting a more sustainable planet that has tackled the environmental and nature crises, one report from a couple of years ago suggested that if everybody did this in the UK, you would save 127 million tons of carbon emissions each year, which is the same as taking every single private car off the road.
Wow.
We're very much signed up to it, as you might imagine.
Yeah, I can imagine. Definitely aligns with your brand values for sure. And will you be, are there, I guess it's continuously being reviewed in terms of productivity or output or, impact on the organization and your organizational strategy. Is there anything that, and this is actually linking into one of the questions that's been asked, is there anything that you'll be sharing on that or publishing on that people can perhaps use to take it to their workplace and say, look, this is something that someone else is doing, we should really consider it?
Yeah, I mean, there are, obviously some of the things we do, it's difficult to actually measure because obviously you're campaigning and so on.
Yeah.
So it's not, I wouldn't pretend that it's the same as, say, a factory or something like that, where you can say you've produced so many units. But as I say, I think the proof of the pudding will be in eating over time. As I say, we're still intending to deliver the same number of campaigns, the same amount of work as we were prior to the change. And individual objectives haven't been sort of slimmed down or anything. In terms of how things are going, we're finding it is working well. People are reporting that they are feeling a lot more sort of in tune with their work and so on. But there are some smaller teams in particular where it is a bit more of a challenge. So for example, we have teams that work in the legal and political sectors, which are fairly small in numbers. They have to cover the whole week, so we do need to sort of look at how we support them and so on. So sometimes people are working a 5-day week and then taking time back, that sort of thing. So
Yeah.
it's not something you can just sort of do just like that. We spent a lot of time looking at things like our meetings culture, planning and decision-making processes and so on, to make sure that they were aligned and a bit more focused as well. I think in terms of evidence from elsewhere, though, I would encourage anybody who's looking at this to look at the Autonomy website or the 4-Day Working Week campaign. You'll see on there the outputs from the nationwide pilots that were done in the UK, USA and Australia last year. They cover all sorts of sectors: banking, manufacturing. There's even a fish and chip shop in there, and they have all, well, 92% often have continued with the 4-day working week at the end of their pilots.
Yeah, really interesting. Thank you. Jade, a specific question for you as well. Adrian has spoken a lot about pilots, and you work with a different type of pilot in day-to-day at the air ambulance. And one of the things that we were talking about before was, and actually Adrian, you hinted at this just then, certain teams, they can't just they can't do a 4-day week. It's just not an option for some people, depending on what it is that they do. How do you manage that, Jade, culturally? Because you've got some people who are, in the service, as it were, at the air ambulance, and some people in the charity. And there's kind of different flexibility needs or approaches. And how do you manage that across the organisation?
Yeah, it's a very ongoing conversation. I think particularly because burnout is an issue with all frontline service workers since the beginning of the pandemic. So I think the first step that we've taken is to acknowledge that we have two different working cultures, and the same thing isn't going to work for two very different parts of the organisation. So I guess the challenge is how you maintain the organisational culture when you have two very different working environments and still maintain that shared sense of purpose. So that's kind of what we're grappling with.
Yeah.
And I think the approach is that flexibility looks different in both of those different areas. So we tackled the one, I guess, that was easier, use that word advisedly, and looked at the charity and how we could implement a hybrid working culture. And then I guess the question that we're looking at the moment is then, what does equity look like in this situation? And what does flexibility look like when you work shift works, when you work shift work? And I think applying our values to that situation is also really important. So how do we take a human-centered, compassionate approach? How do we show compassion to our frontline colleagues, given that we can't offer them flexibility in the same way? Yeah. And really, risking that becoming unfair or unequitable. I don't think there's an easy answer. I think there's lots of organisations grappling with this at the moment, but there are some things that you can give a shift working team some control over. So if they can't work 4-day week, or they can't pick their hours because the shifts are the shift and the service needs to operate within those parameters, can you give them control over the timing and the frequency of their shifts, more stability in their work schedules by being able to plan further ahead so that they can arrange their personal life around their working life, offer them more paid leave. So these are all the elements I think that we could consider to bring in a bit more flexibility to focus on well-being and welfare of those teams, knowing what their challenges are.
Yeah,
very much a work in progress.
Yeah, work in progress, and almost sort of case by case, which comes back to, I think, a big theme of this discussion today. It's really a lot more about the individual, and yes, an organisation needs a policy, but then you have to bear in mind the individual at the end of that policy, and what's going to work for them, and how we can be as flexible as possible around it.
Yeah, and also just on that, if you individualize everything, you risk dispersing the culture. So I think you have to be really clear about the principles by which you're making all of those decisions. So has the organization agreed what's important? to them what the priorities are, and then everything else just fall neatly out of that in an ideal world.
We've had a question around that actually about, is there somewhere you can go for inspiration for a good policy, or, a good flexible working policy that could perhaps be a starting point for people looking at trying to get this into their organisations? Don't know if any of our panelists have got guidance on that, where would be a good starting point.
I think the CIPD has got some really good starting points, and they've actually got quite an innovative approach to policy making and questions to think about, so that you can actually develop it to suit your own organisation. So that's where I'd always start.
Nice, thank you.
You can also get some good things from the NCVO sometimes. They have some good examples.
Nice, thank you very much.
And actually, if you Google it, it throws up organisations' individual policies as well quite often. Lots of charities, especially the larger ones, publish their policies online. So if you're looking for some specific example, I just Google it and see what comes up.
And some inspiration, yeah, definitely. No idea is a new idea. We've been asked about as well, I'm just going to carry on with some questions just for the last few minutes. Has anyone managed to do or look at any policy or have any tips for flexible working internationally, and particularly across different time zones? Has anyone come across that or got any advice on that? I don't know, because you're not international organisations as such, are they?
No, we've had conversations about what would happen if I moved overseas, or I decided I wanted to work from Spain for 3 months over summer.
Yeah, nice. See you there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think our barrier has always been the tax issues, because they're different for every country and it's quite complicated. And we felt like we didn't have the internal expertise to make those decisions in a fully informed way. So for now, it's probably not, but we're happy to look at it under our flexible working, if it's a serious question.
Yeah.
Dodged it, really.
Well, yeah, fair enough. It's a tricky one. Another question that we've had come through, any tips on running things like creative or collaboration workshops virtually? So obviously we spoke a bit about, they're the sort of thing that are great to do face to face, but what happens if they have to be virtually? Are there any tools or tips that you would share that sort of make it a bit easier to collaborate when you're all online?
I think someone mentioned in the chat Miro board. Sorry, Adrian.
No, please, sorry.
And so I think someone mentioned in the chat sort of Miro boards and those sort of tools which you can use to do your virtual post-its and things like that, which I think are really useful. I think what I always find difficult with creative things virtually is the kind of energy levels, and I think keeping those up, because I do think often you're feeding ideas off of each other a lot of the time, which is hard, and it's just hard to read a kind of virtual room in the same way. But at the same time, there are people that think and work in different ways, and for some, actually going away on their own and coming up with loads of ideas in isolation and then throwing them into a Miro board in advance of a creative session can be the way they prefer to work, rather than sort of on the spot in a meeting. And I'm always conscious, I often do more of the talking sometimes, just because that's my personality. So being aware that, there are people that work in different ways. So I think in some ways it can level the playing field a little bit being online, because you do have the opportunity to feed in kind of on your own. But at the same time, I think there is a lot to be said for the cultural kind of element of all being together and coming up with ideas and new ways of thinking. And I think you can just read the room a bit better, I guess, when you're all face to face. But certainly, I think just embracing tools like Miro and obviously using like Trello boards and things like that, where you can tag people in things and keep people kind of in the loop on what's going on like in real time. Is quite a good thing as well. So and finding what works for you, I guess, and for your individual brief, like what's the best way, I suppose, to get the ideas that you're looking for, and whether that is online or in trying to kind of push for it to be in person.
Mm-hmm. Adrian, did you have a response to that question as well? Sorry, was that?
I think it was just about Jamboards, but Liz has covered that.
Oh, great. Yeah, it's funny. I find Miro really. I don't. My head just doesn't work in that way. To sort of follow someone around a Miro board, I really struggle with it. And a lot of people that I work with really love working with Miro. So it's interesting all the kind of the different platforms and techs that have come that sort of work for some people and really don't work for others. Trying to find that balance is quite interesting. A final question then. I think we've covered everything else, which is asking about something we sort of touched on a little bit earlier, actually. So how do you square off flexible working with presenteeism, or things like timesheets? So, you know, if people really need to prove, I guess, their time at work, and if people are working from home a lot, do you ever find that there's a kind of mismatch in that balance? I mean, certainly for me, the organisations I work with, I think now it's so known that when you're at home, you are working. We've all proved it. We've done it for years. But what if there's a bit of a need, I guess, to show that a bit more, or to combat that feeling of presenteeism a bit more?
Yeah, I think. So I think certainly from our experience so far, the issue has been kind of less about kind of are people present and at their desks, and more about as we were talking about earlier, the kind of blurring of the work-life boundary, which means that people are just carrying on working because they're not having to leave the office at a particular time. So I think it's making sure that there's kind of clarity around what's expected of people when they're at home, and that just because you don't have to get up and leave the office, you should still be sort of managing work hours and not just kind of keeping going when there are things to do. But yeah, it's certainly been more on that front rather than the sort of are people working enough, which I think in this kind of environment you have to trust people to manage their work effectively. You know, and I think it has to be based on that really, otherwise it just doesn't work. Yeah, it's got to be based on trust.
I think sometimes you need to be quite explicit about that. If there are concerns, your managers need to have the skills to address them directly and have that conversation. Otherwise, you know, if one person gets away with it, everything starts to go a bit wrong. So I think it's you're allowing a lot more freedom and flexibility, and the flip side of that is your managers really need to be on the performance and be prepared to have the conversations and address it if it's not happening. So that's the balance we need to find.
Yeah, and even just that feeling, I guess, of some people within the team thinking other people are doing less can be quite tough on a team mentality. So it's making sure that everyone's on the same page. Goes back to the point. Yeah,
I was about to say that it's outcomes focused. So what are you actually delivering? Is everybody really clear about what needs to happen and when and what's expected? And if all of that framework is in place, then you don't need to worry about bums on seats. It's just, is the work being delivered as you expected?
Brilliant.
And Adrian was saying earlier, it's, you know, if you've got your long working day options in a way, as long as you do your core hours, it doesn't matter when you do them, which I guess is that trust in your workforce. And you therefore you've got to measure it not by when you logged on and when you logged off, but you know what you delivered ultimately. So that's really important.
All about the outputs. Thank you guys. It's been really great talking to you all. Massive thanks for joining as panelists, and thanks to everyone who's attended today, and big thanks to the PRCA for organising and facilitating this as well. If anyone's got any other questions that we haven't answered or that come to you later, just pop them through to the PRCA or to myself, and I can try and get them answered for you. This recording will go out within the next week or so as well. So if there's any people within your organisation that you think could be enlightened by our discussion today, then please do share it on. But yeah, just a massive thank you to everyone for contributing today, and thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Take care.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.